The chandeliers sparkled above me, their golden glow casting delicate patterns across the marble floor, while laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses filled the grand hall. Everyone seemed wrapped in the magic of the evening, their gowns flowing like waves of color, their conversations weaving seamlessly into the hum of celebration. I stood among it all, the weight of polished elegance pressing in, a place where perfection was expected and appearances mattered more than truth. The scent of roses mixed with the faint trace of expensive perfume, every detail carefully curated to impress. Yet beneath the shimmer and luxury, a hollow space grew inside me, a quiet ache that the music and grandeur could not drown. The wedding's luxury setting contrasted sharply with inner emptiness, and that truth revealed itself the moment I stepped into the hall. Everything around me was orchestrated to perfection, the chandeliers suspended like constellations above, scattering light across tables draped in ivory silk, crystal glasses catching the gleam of golden candlelight, and the faint strains of a string quartet filling the air with timeless melodies. Guests moved elegantly, their conversations bubbling with laughter, their attire flawless, each detail a symbol of refinement and privilege. It was the kind of scene that could have been lifted from a glossy magazine spread, the kind of environment where beauty and excess drowned out anything that might appear ordinary. And yet, within all that splendor, a quiet dissonance settled into my chest, like a note out of place in a song that was otherwise perfectly composed. The air smelled of roses and white lilies, their fragrance so carefully selected it felt as though even the scent was curated for its sophistication. Polished marble beneath my feet seemed to glow under the soft, warm lighting, every step echoing faintly as if reminding me I didn't quite belong in the rhythm of the evening. Waiters in pristine black suits glided silently between tables, balancing trays of champagne flutes, their practiced movements seamless and unnoticeable, unless, like me, you were looking for distraction. Each detail screamed of opulence, of status, of lives lived with the kind of ease that required little more than showing up and being admired. But as I stood there, enveloped in extravagance, I couldn't ignore how strangely empty it all felt. How the perfection became suffocating rather than comforting. Everywhere I looked, people seemed at home in this world of abundance. Women in dresses stitched with jewels leaned into conversations, their laughter chiming like bells, while men discussed investments and vacations with effortless confidence. Eyes sparkled not only with the reflection of chandeliers, but with the certainty that they belonged there. Yet, as I observed, I felt a separation, as though I were watching a play from the wings rather than acting on the stage. The grandeur that was meant to inspire awe instead deepened the void, reminding me that surface beauty does little to soothe when one's spirit feels unseen. The music swelled around me, but its harmony clashed with the quiet ache I carried inside. It wasn't that the luxury itself was unappealing. Anyone could marvel at the artistry of the floral arrangements, the glittering silverware placed with military precision, or the cascading white cake crowned with delicate sugar roses. But beneath that surface-level admiration, something sharper lingered. There was no warmth in the perfection, no sense of comfort in the wealth that surrounded us. Instead, there was a hollowness, as if all this glamour had been carefully constructed not to bring joy but to convince everyone present of a narrative, that this life, this display, was the pinnacle of happiness. And in that effort to convince, authenticity had been stripped away, leaving only surfaces polished to reflect what others expected to see. I watched couples holding hands with the easy intimacy of long partnerships, watched groups of friends exchanging knowing glances, and saw families taking photos against backdrops designed to look effortlessly enchanting. And still, that sharp contrast inside me grew louder. I was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet I felt alone, unseen amid the spectacle. The very abundance that should have filled me with pride or gratitude left me restless instead. The grandeur of the room amplified the silence I carried in my heart, making it impossible to ignore the emptiness growing between the laughter and the clinking of glasses. The irony was hard to escape. Here I was, dressed in elegance, standing beneath lights that cost more than entire homes, and yet I could not feel the beauty of the moment the way others seemed to. The silk of my gown brushed softly against my skin, jewels glistened at my ears, and the champagne in my hand was vintage, the kind that was supposed to taste of luxury. But all those details, no matter how carefully chosen, rang hollow because the setting could not disguise the absence of something deeper. The night's extravagance served only to illuminate what was missing. As though the brighter the chandeliers burned, the darker the shadow inside me became. The setting demanded admiration, but my heart demanded truth, and they clashed against each other in a way that left me caught in the middle. I was supposed to smile, to blend into the chorus of voices exclaiming how beautiful everything was, yet each compliment I overheard sounded rehearsed, almost mechanical. I felt like a stranger in a painting, brushed into a scene that didn't belong to me. And in that collision between outer luxury and inner emptiness, I began to understand how isolating beauty can be when it is devoid of meaning. The weight of societal expectations and appearances overshadowed genuine connection, and it was impossible not to feel that tension pressing down from the very start of the evening. Every movement, every smile, every whispered exchange seemed choreographed for the sake of presentation rather than truth. The people around me wore their confidence like tailored garments, each detail curated to reinforce the illusion of perfection. Even their laughter felt polished, a sound designed to reassure those listening that they were exactly where they were supposed to be, living precisely the kind of life others might envy. Yet beneath that surface I sensed something brittle, a fragility hidden beneath the dazzling attire and poised expressions, as though all of us were playing characters in a story dictated by invisible rules. The pressure was subtle but relentless. A glance that lingered too long on someone's dress. The raised eyebrows at a slightly out-of-place accessory. The way conversations steered toward names, titles, and accomplishments. It all spoke of an unspoken agreement that appearances mattered most. No one asked questions that dug too deeply. No one lingered on topics that might reveal vulnerability. Instead, everything was measured, light, and designed to maintain the atmosphere of effortless luxury. It became clear that the evening was less about celebrating love and more about affirming status, about reminding each other of the roles they played in this carefully built hierarchy. And as much as I tried to blend in, I couldn't help but notice how heavy that performance became, how it drained the air of sincerity. The gowns that shimmered under the chandeliers weren't just fabric, they were declarations of belonging. Silent arguments for one's place in a circle that prized elegance above authenticity. The men's tailored suits and subtle yet extravagant watches were signals too, each detail part of a language that was unspoken but universally understood in that room. It was a competition disguised as camaraderie, a stage where everyone knew the script, smile at the right moments, compliment the right details, never let the cracks in your life show. And if they did, ensure they were dressed up as quirks rather than flaws. The expectation to maintain that facade clung to me as tightly as my own dress, pressing against my ribs with every breath. I found myself nodding through conversations that didn't reach beyond the surface, smiling at remarks that lacked substance, all the while aware that genuine connection had no place in this setting. To admit loneliness, doubt, or even simple boredom would be to step outside the narrative, to risk judgment in a room where judgment was wrapped in politeness but cut just as deeply. So I mirrored the same energy, careful not to disrupt the delicate balance, though inside it felt like swallowing my own voice. It wasn't only about how we looked, it was about how we moved, what we said, and even how we listened. Silence wasn't a space for thought. It was an opportunity for someone else to shine brighter, to capture attention with stories of vacations abroad, of promotions, of accomplishments designed to impress. There was no room for uncertainty, no space for admitting that beneath the fine jewelry and glass of champagne, one might feel hollow or adrift. The weight of those expectations settled on my shoulders like a cloak, heavy and suffocating, reminding me at every turn that being authentic was a risk few here were willing to take. Even the smallest gestures revealed the dominance of appearance over truth. Couples held hands just tightly enough to be noticed, their smiles perfectly timed, though I wondered how many of them felt disconnected once the spotlight shifted elsewhere. Parents praised their children's achievements loudly, their words heavy with pride, but also with an edge that hinted at comparison, as though success mattered less for personal fulfillment and more for the impression it left on others. Compliments were given generously, but often with an undertone, a subtle weight that reminded the receiver of the competition hidden in the kindness. I realized then how exhausting it must be to live like this constantly, to build an entire existence around what others see rather than what one feels. And in that exhaustion, true connection suffocated. There was no room for messy conversations about fear or struggle, no space for laughter that bubbled up unpolished and unrestrained, no comfort in admitting imperfection. Everything was wrapped tightly, polished until it gleamed, even if the shine came at the cost of authenticity. The longer I stood in that environment, the more I felt the gap between what was expected and what I truly craved. I didn't want to compete in silent contests of wealth or beauty, didn't want to plaster a smile across my face to prove I belonged. What I wanted was to look someone in the eye and feel the ease of being seen, really seen, beyond the dress, beyond the jewelry, beyond the setting. But in that space, appearances left no room for such truths, and the weight of those expectations became heavier with every passing hour, pressing down until it felt impossible to breathe freely. Subtle moments revealed emotional neglect hidden beneath glamour, and they often appeared when the noise of the room quieted just enough for me to notice the small details. At first glance, everything sparkled with beauty, the flowers arranged with flawless symmetry, the music filling every pause with elegance, the laughter echoing like a chorus rehearsed to perfection. But behind that polished surface, there were cracks that only someone paying close attention could see. It was in the way a couple posed for pictures with glowing smiles, only to step apart immediately once the camera was lowered. It was in the glance of a woman who nodded through a conversation, but whose eyes kept drifting away, searching for something or someone more meaningful. These fleeting moments whispered truths the luxury tried to smother, exposing that wealth and status could not disguise the absence of tenderness. At my table, the conversation sparkled on the surface, compliments about the menu, admiration of the decor, and light-hearted jokes, but beneath it, I sensed a hollowness. No one asked how anyone truly felt. No one lingered on stories that might reveal something vulnerable. A man next to me boasted about a recent acquisition, his voice laced with pride, but when his wife attempted to share a personal story, he brushed it aside with a dismissive nod. The moment was small, barely noticeable in the flow of chatter, but it carried a sharpness that cut through the performance of the evening. Her smile didn't falter, yet her silence afterward told the real story. That single glance between them revealed a gap that no amount of luxury could fill. As the evening unfolded, I noticed more of these moments, little snapshots of disconnection. Parents proudly paraded their children, speaking of their schools, their accomplishments, their talents, but when the children tugged on their sleeves, craving attention in a way no accolade could satisfy, the adults shushed them gently, steering the focus back to themselves. I saw the disappointment in the children's eyes, a fleeting sadness quickly swallowed by the distractions around them. In that instant, the glamour of the event became a backdrop for quiet neglect, the kind that doesn't scream or shatter but lingers in small omissions. Even the laughter, so constant and bright, carried undertones of weariness. I could tell when someone forced it, their eyes not matching the sound. I could hear the pauses between words where a different truth wanted to surface, but was quickly tucked away to keep up appearances. There was a woman at another table who laughed at every joke her partner made, yet her hand rested limply on her lap, never reaching for his, never leaning toward him the way couples naturally do when affection flows freely. It was a detail so small most would overlook it, but to me, it revealed an absence far greater than silence. As I observed these subtleties, I began to realize how easily the glamour distracted from what truly mattered. The grandeur of the setting created a veil that kept people from acknowledging the gaps in their relationships, the loneliness buried beneath wealth, the neglect that was too quiet to disrupt the performance. It was as though the extravagance acted as a shield, protecting people from confronting what they lacked. The polished surfaces and glittering lights reflected only what people wanted to be seen, not the truths hiding in the shadows. There was a particular moment when the bride and groom shared their first dance. The room erupted in admiration, phones lifted to capture the scene, smiles shining as the couple glided across the floor. It looked like perfection, a portrait of love framed by music and light. Yet when the bride leaned in to whisper something, I caught the way his eyes scanned the crowd instead of meeting hers. The moment was subtle, nearly invisible, but to me it spoke volumes. The affection the room celebrated felt hollow when even in the spotlight, The connection between them seemed distracted, fragile. I understood then that neglect doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is the quiet absence of presence. The subtle way someone's voice isn't heard. The way affection isn't returned. The way words are spoken without meaning behind them. In a place designed to impress, these details could easily vanish into the spectacle. But once I noticed them, I couldn't unsee them. They multiplied, appearing in every corner, until the beauty of the evening felt like a mask hiding countless untold stories of loneliness and yearning. The irony of it all weighed heavily. The glamour that was meant to symbolize love, connection, and happiness only magnified the absence of those very things. Every glittering detail reminded me that behind the perfect images, emotional neglect could still thrive quietly, unseen by most, but deeply felt by those who carried it. It was there in the pauses, in the forced smiles, in the eyes that drifted away from the ones they should have been looking at most. These moments, small and fleeting, told the truest story of the night, one that no luxury could disguise. The environment highlighted isolation despite being surrounded by people, and that isolation seemed to grow stronger the longer I stood within the grandeur of the evening. The hall was filled with bodies, laughter, conversations, and movement, yet it all blurred together in a way that made me feel more detached than included. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only appears when one is encircled by people yet remains unseen. And that night was a perfect example of it. From the outside, everything looked alive. Voices rose and fell like waves, glasses clinked. Music wrapped itself around every corner of the room. But none of it reached me in any meaningful way. The more vibrant the atmosphere appeared, the more silent my own presence felt, as if I were invisible among the carefully polished lives being performed around me. I wandered through clusters of people, each group absorbed in its own rhythm of talk and laughter. Their circles seemed closed. Not in an overtly unkind way, but in the subtle posture of bodies turned inward, conversations held in tones that carried little space for interruption. I smiled when someone glanced my way, offered polite greetings, but the words felt mechanical, exchanged more out of obligation than genuine interest. Their eyes shifted quickly, already searching for the next person of importance to engage with. It wasn't hostility, it was indifference, and in many ways, that was heavier to bear. To feel overlooked, unnecessary, and peripheral in a place designed to be shared made the isolation sharper. Even the music, though beautiful, added to the sense of separation. The melodies carried emotion, but rather than filling me with warmth, they became reminders of the disconnect. Couples swayed together, friends leaned into one another, laughter bubbled naturally in familiar groups, and I stood there, a figure caught between their joy and my silence. There was a rhythm to their togetherness that I could not access, as if I were out of sync with the dance of the evening, my own movements, lifting a glass, nodding politely, shifting my gaze across the room, felt out of place, like gestures meant to imitate belonging rather than embody it. What struck me most was how carefully everyone seemed to avoid silence, as though stillness might expose something too real. People filled every moment with conversation about vacations, careers, homes, and successes, but none of it sounded intimate. They were words spoken to fill the air, to project images of happiness, not to build genuine connections. And as I listened, I realized that isolation doesn't only come from being left out. It can also come from being part of conversations that skim the surface without ever touching the heart. Surrounded by talk yet starved of meaning, I felt myself retreat further inward. At one point, I stepped aside to the edge of the room, near the tall windows that framed the city beyond. The lights outside blinked faintly in the distance, small yet steady, and I found myself staring at them, feeling more kinship with their quiet glow than with the people inside. The city seemed honest in its stillness, while the room behind me pulsed with artifice. My reflection in the glass looked strangely separate from the crowd reflected beside me, like I belonged to another world entirely. That small moment of standing apart, looking out while everyone else looked in, solidified the truth of my isolation. The irony was that isolation didn't mean being physically alone. It was the opposite. I was surrounded by more people than I could count, yet none of them truly saw me. I could have disappeared into the crowd without anyone noticing, my absence blending into the sea of movement and chatter, The realization was jarring, that one could exist so completely in a space and yet be invisible. The laughter, the conversations, the music, all of it seemed to orbit around a center I could not reach. I was present in body but absent in spirit, a spectator rather than a participant. As the night went on, I noticed the same detachment mirrored in others. There were faces smiling without light in their eyes, people nodding along to words without listening, couples standing side by side but not really together. It reminded me that isolation isn't always obvious. It can hide in plain sight, dressed in fine clothes and polite gestures. Many of us drift through such evenings, performing the roles expected of us, while beneath the surface we feel the same disconnection. But unlike the honesty of admitting loneliness, the setting demanded silence about such truths. So everyone smiled, everyone laughed, and everyone carried their own version of solitude beneath the glitter of the chandeliers. That duality, the noise outside and the silence inside, was what defined the night for me. The environment, with all its grandeur, should have offered connection, belonging, and celebration. But instead, it magnified the emptiness of being unseen. It showed me that sometimes the most isolating place is not an empty room but a crowded one, where presence is acknowledged but essence is ignored. The sheer weight of that realization settled in with each passing hour, pressing against me until the isolation felt louder than the music itself. The facade of wealth and prestige masked personal struggles, and it became clear as I observed how easily luxury could be used as a shield. Every detail of the evening was curated to project an image of success, stability, and refinement. Yet beneath the glittering surfaces, subtle cracks revealed themselves. The clothes, the jewelry, the conversation topics, all of them worked together to create a story, one that insisted everything was perfect. But if you watched closely, if you listened beyond the rehearsed words, the truth was not nearly as seamless. People clung to material symbols not just for admiration, but as armor, a way to cover the insecurities and challenges that lurked beneath the surface. The gowns shimmered in the light, designer pieces that spoke of privilege, but the eyes of the women wearing them often told different stories. There was one woman who laughed as she gestured with her champagne glass, sparkling diamonds catching the glow of the chandeliers. She carried herself with confidence, her voice commanding attention, but in between her sentences, her smile flickered. It was gone in an instant, replaced quickly with another expression of poise, but the fleeting shadow revealed that her strength was partly performance. The jewels around her neck were dazzling, but no sparkle could disguise the weariness etched into her face. In that moment, I saw how appearances functioned less as celebration and more as concealment. The men, too, wore their prestige like armor. Their tailored suits and polished shoes seemed to announce authority before a word was spoken. Conversations among them centered on investments, properties, and deals, each detail carefully emphasized to reaffirm their place in the hierarchy of success. Yet when one man faltered, hesitating as he spoke about a recent setback, the quick shift of his tone told me more than his words. He redirected the story toward an accomplishment, away from vulnerability, as though admitting struggle might tarnish the carefully constructed image. The facade demanded perfection, and so the struggles were tucked neatly behind closed doors, hidden by stories of triumph. I realized then how heavy that performance must feel, to constantly maintain the illusion that life is free of hardship. Behind the luxurious outfits and eloquent conversations were likely bills, arguments, disappointments, and fears. Yet none of those truths were allowed to step into the light of that evening. Struggles had no place in this performance, not because they didn't exist, but because they threatened the image that everyone worked so hard to uphold. And so the wealth became a costume, and the prestige became a stage, designed to distract from the very real emotions lingering in the shadows. It became especially apparent when I noticed the small interactions that didn't align with the grand display. A couple, dressed impeccably, walked through the hall arm in arm, but their eyes never met. They smiled for photographs, their postures elegant and composed, yet when the cameras lowered, they stepped slightly apart, their bodies revealing the distance their performance denied. They wore their wealth as proof of unity, yet the silence between them betrayed something fragile. Prestige had built them a fortress, but within it, they still carried struggles too deep for the setting to acknowledge. There was another moment when a man spoke proudly of his business ventures, his voice confident, his presence commanding. But his hand gripped his glass tightly, his knuckles pale, a quiet tremor betraying his nerves. He laughed loudly, spoke with assurance, but his body whispered a different truth. That glass in his hand, that forceful laugh, it was all part of the facade, masking the weight of worry he refused to reveal. The wealth around him made it easier to hide, because the glitter distracted from the reality of his unease. The longer I watched, the clearer it became that everyone was performing, in one way or another. Wealth wasn't only about enjoying privilege. It was about concealing the imperfections that might otherwise draw judgment. Prestige wasn't just a mark of success, it was a shield against vulnerability. And yet, the irony was unmistakable. The more people tried to mask their struggles, the more those struggles bled through the cracks of their performance. Forced smiles, distracted glances, and tense postures said what words could not. The entire evening felt like a stage where everyone was cast in roles, each determined to prove that their life was enviable. Yet, beneath the roles, the very human struggles, loneliness, fear, dissatisfaction, were still alive, waiting in the silence between conversations. The wealth and prestige offered them cover, but it was a thin cover, fragile enough that anyone paying close attention could glimpse the truth beneath. The grandeur did not erase the struggles, it only pushed them into the background, hidden beneath layers of performance that demanded applause even when the actors longed for rest. A quiet realization began to stir beneath the noise of celebration, and it unfolded not in a sudden rush but in gentle waves, each one pulling me closer to a truth I had been avoiding. Surrounded by the glittering chandeliers, the endless chatter, and the elegance of every detail, I started to sense that the beauty of the evening was not meant for me. It wasn't that I didn't belong physically. I was dressed in the same refinement, standing among the same crowd. But emotionally I was detached, watching the event from a place that no one else could see. The realization was not about the luxury itself, but about the emptiness it revealed within me. A hollowness that no setting, no wealth, no carefully crafted performance could conceal. At first, I tried to push the feeling away, convincing myself that it was only a momentary lapse, perhaps tiredness or distraction. But as the night unfolded, the sensation deepened. I noticed how often my smile felt forced, how often my thoughts drifted away from the people speaking to me. I found myself rehearsing responses rather than engaging, nodding politely while my mind lingered elsewhere. The disconnect was too sharp to ignore, and it dawned on me that the emptiness I felt wasn't just about the event, it was about the life that surrounded it, the life I had been living in spaces like this one. The realization came in fragments. It was in the sound of laughter that didn't reach the eyes of the people laughing. It was in the sight of couples holding hands yet standing miles apart in spirit. It was in the conversations that circled endlessly around accomplishments and possessions, but never dared touch the rawness of what it meant to feel joy or pain. I began to see that everything around me was constructed, polished to perfection, yet hollow at its core. And if the people here were content to live in that performance, why did it leave me feeling more adrift than ever? I stepped aside for a moment, near the corner of the room where the light was softer, and watched the celebration unfold without me. From that distance, the scene looked even more surreal, like a painting alive with color but lacking depth. The grandeur was undeniable, but so was the emptiness beneath it. I realized that I had been part of this same cycle, participating in the smiles, the nods, the polished words, all while silencing the truths I carried inside. And in that stillness, something shifted. I understood that the dissatisfaction wasn't a passing feeling. It was the quiet voice of my own truth, one I had buried beneath the pressure to belong. The noise of celebration only sharpened the voice within me. The more the room erupted in applause for toasts and speeches, the louder my own thoughts became. The dissonance between the outer world and my inner world grew so wide that it was impossible to pretend anymore. I realized I had been living in an environment where being seen was more important than being understood, where wealth measured worth, and where appearances had replaced authenticity. The ache in my chest was not from the isolation of a single evening, but from years of inhabiting a life that celebrated everything except what truly mattered to me. As I watched others move gracefully through the evening, their gestures polished and precise, I recognized the exhaustion I felt mirrored faintly in their faces. Maybe they too carried the weight of pretending, though not all of them were willing to admit it. and it struck me that my loneliness wasn't just about being unseen, it was about seeing too clearly. I could no longer ignore the truth that this world, no matter how golden it appeared, left me hungry for something deeper, something real. The realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because it forced me to confront the possibility that I didn't fit into the life I had been living, liberating because acknowledging it meant I didn't have to keep silencing myself. I began to see the luxury for what it truly was, not a symbol of happiness, but a distraction, a veil designed to keep the cracks from showing. And beneath that veil, everyone, myself included, was human, fragile, imperfect, and longing for more than appearances could ever provide. As the evening went on, the celebration roared around me, but inside, the noise fell away. I heard only the quiet truth rising within, reminding me that wealth and prestige could never replace the comfort of genuine connection, that appearances could never fill the emptiness of being unseen, and that a life lived for others' approval would never feel like my own. That quiet realization, though it arrived gently, was powerful enough to shift everything I thought I knew about where I belonged and what I truly needed. In the end, what became clear was that no amount of glittering chandeliers, designer gowns, or flawless performances could silence the deeper truths hidden beneath the surface. The wedding was a portrait of perfection, but one painted to impress rather than to connect, and within that beauty I discovered a silence that spoke louder than the music. Surrounded by people yet unseen, I felt the weight of appearances that valued status more than sincerity, wealth more than warmth, and prestige more than presence. Every smile, every toast, every carefully crafted gesture revealed not only the grandeur, but also the emptiness it concealed. My quiet realization was that life built on appearances alone can never satisfy the heart. To be seen, to be heard, and to live authentically matters far more than any illusion of luxury, and the hollowness of that night became the beginning of a deeper truth I could no longer ignore.